Lisa Holm. A video of a countdown clock named 13 was uploaded to YouTube on May 24, 2015, by Lisa Holm. And on June 7, 2015, exactly 13 days later, a 17-year-old Swedish girl called Lisa Holm vanished after working a shift at a cafe in Blomberg, western Sweden. She was discovered dead in a barn a short distance from her home after several days of searching. The youngster was found half-clothed and with tape covering her mouth, even though an autopsy revealed she had not been sexually molested. Given that she vanished exactly 13 days after the video was uploaded, a lot of people think that the film was uploaded by her murderer and was intended to symbolize the countdown to her death. Additionally, other witnesses said they saw a message indicating the owner of the channel had uploaded a second private video and had purportedly commented with a drawn map, which some speculate may be connected to an unsolved homicide. Police asserted that there was no connection between the video and the case, calling it a coincidence. In the end, a DNA test revealed that the blood on Lisa's clothing belonged to a 31-year-old guy named Balavicius. There were also traces of his semen in the barn. His attorney, Inger Ronbag, testified during the trial that her client had been in the barn a few days prior with a minor cut on his hand, and that cut might have ended up on Lisa's clothing when it fell to the ground. Furthermore, she maintained that few days prior to the incident, her client had engaged in some masturbation in the barn where he occasionally worked. But the judge convicted him of the crime and gave him a life sentence. The YouTube video was never brought up in the case, and it's unclear whether it has any actual connection to the crime or if it was just a coincidence. If you're fascinated by true crime and enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up to stay updated on all our latest content. Moving on to the next case. Sophie Sergie. Born in 1973, Sophie Sergie is a native of Pickeys Point, a remote village on the Yukon River in western Alaska. Pickeys Point was mostly populated by Aboriginal people at the time, when the population numbered less than 200. Sophie's childhood in this close-knit community was influenced by the special challenges and natural beauty of rural Alaska. Sophie was imbued with a strong sense of community, family values, and a deep connection to her indigenous origin by the village, which was renowned for its isolation and tiny population. The strong bonds that characterized the way of life among the people who lived in the isolated Alaskan wilderness at Pickeys Point were perhaps what made life there so special. Sophie was thought of as a model citizen and a remarkable daughter. Her ambition to achieve her goals and her intelligence and diligence were what characterized her as a person. She developed into a role model in the community, especially for the younger people. Sophie's aspirations went beyond the boundaries of her sleepy village, and she cultivated hopes of making notable life achievements. Sophie's dedication to learning was evident even in the face of obstacles brought on by the far-off location and scarce resources. She was fortunate enough to obtain a full scholarship to the University of Alaska, a famous school that required her to move almost 500 miles from her hometown. The university's dynamic and culturally varied atmosphere replaced the tight-knit indigenous community, marking a momentous change. Sophie was fascinated by the wonders of the water, and her academic interests at the university were centered around marine biology. Even though Sophie was doing well in school, she had a life-changing event that forced her to put her college career on hold for a while. This choice was made for two reasons. At first, Sophie felt a strong feeling of obligation to her family, especially her ailing mother, and a strong want to return home to take care of them. She also decided to work and save money for necessary dental treatment after realizing the financial constraints that come with her scholastic journey. During her time off from university, Sophie worked as a teaching assistant at a school in her community of origin. This decision showed her commitment to giving back to the community and her excellent work ethic. By managing her finances and making an effort to save money for her dental procedure rather than depending on her relatives, Sophie demonstrated her self-reliance and accountability. She intended to re-enroll in college after completing her 2 years of studies in marine biology, signifying her unwavering commitment to realizing her academic goals. But in April 1993, Sophie's life tragically changed on a weekend trip to Fairbanks. On April 25, 1993, Sophie took a plane to Fairbanks for a dentist visit. It appeared to be a typical day with routine activities. She intended to stay with her friend Shirley, a University of Alaska Fairbanks student who lived in the dorm Bartlett Hall. Sophie went out with friends that night, having dinner and a movie, and participating in activities that reflected the lifestyles of a great deal of college students. In what is believed to be Sophie's final known snapshot, she is shown smiling broadly and appearing ready to welcome the world as she embarks on a sunset viewing excursion. After making her way back to Shirley's room in Bartlett Hall, Sophie enjoyed a laid-back evening with Shirley and her boyfriend, Noah, while watching films. Sophie went to the common area later in the evening for a drink and then settled on a smoke. Shirley suggested that Sophie smoke in the bathroom on the second floor to escape the bitter cold in Alaska. Sophie consented, and Shirley and Noah made the decision to alert Sophie of their outing by leaving a note on the door while she was away. They had no idea that their decision would inadvertently deepen the mystery surrounding Sophie's abduction. When Shirley got back to her dorm room the next morning, Sophie was nowhere to be seen. Shirley called the police to report her friend Sophie missing because she was worried and couldn't find any evidence of her. Simultaneously, without being aware of the tragedy that was transpiring in Fairbanks, Sophie's orthodontist called Sophie's family to inquire about her absence from a scheduled visit. As the day went on, a caretaker in charge of the Bartlett Hall second-floor lavatory discovered something unsettling. After a vicious attack that included binding, gagging, tasering, beating, stabbing, and finally a gunshot to the back of her skull, Sophie Sergie's body was found in the bathtub. With Sophie's clothes all tattered and her corpse drenched from the water, the crime scene perfectly captured the brutality of the deed. The University of Alaska Fairbanks community was shocked by the discovery, and local authorities launched an inquiry right once. Because of the shock and amazement caused by Sophie's brutal murder in a college dorm, there are now more security measures and student mental health resources available. Following the discovery of Sophie's body on April 26, 1993, detectives, forensic experts, and law enforcement personnel descended upon the dorm to carefully examine and record every aspect of the crime scene. To bring the criminal to justice, a thorough investigation was required due to the seriousness and savagery of the murder. Authorities collected evidence after carefully searching the loo for any DNA, hair samples, and fingerprints. Even with 1993's forensic technology limitations, investigators recognized the value of saving these samples for potential breakthroughs in DNA analysis down the road. The fact that there was no alcohol or illegal drugs in Sophie's system upon autopsy emphasizes how heinous the crime against her was. An essential part in piecing together the circumstances leading up to Sophie's death was eyewitness testimony. Later on, 2 students, Vanessa Allen and Jennifer Roy, gave insightful information. During the semester, Vanessa lived in the dorm and described how she felt nervous the night of April 25th when she went into the rarely used East Side lavatory. She became suspicious when she saw the light in the tub room was on, as it was not a frequent occurrence. Vanessa noticed sparks coming from the adjoining room, something akin to firecrackers. Jennifer Roy, a senior who was about to graduate, was also studying late in the dorm on the west side. At about 1:30 a.m. on Monday, she noticed different noises coming from the other bathroom through the shared wall. Jennifer heard something rustle, something loud thud against the wall and someone mumbling, and she assumed it was a guy and a female. Witness statements, forensic evidence, and the graphic details of Sophie's attack led to a greater attempt to locate and capture the attacker. The inquiry ran into difficulties because college campuses are temporary places where some students leave for the semester and never come back. It was difficult to track down people to question because room assignments were always changing, and the dorm roster was not always accurate in reflecting who lived there. By interviewing witnesses and following up on leads, investigators want to piece together the sequence of events that took place the night of the attack and reduce the window of time between 1 a.m. and 5 a.m. when Sophie was killed. The Sophie Sergie case became a cold case over time, one that investigators periodically looked at. As forensic tools advanced, especially in DNA analysis, authorities took advantage of the chance to re-evaluate the evidence. The emphasis turned to utilizing the preserved DNA samples in an attempt to identify the person who killed Sophie in a terrible manner. 2018 saw a breakthrough in the development of DNA testing capabilities. Through the use of contemporary DNA analysis, the preserved samples allowed detectives to create a suspect's genetic profile. The possibility of discovering a match could be greatly increased by comparing this profile to DNA databases. The determination to use cutting-edge forensic tools and the persistent pursuit of justice were crucial in resolving Sophie's case. A crucial part was performed by genetically determined DNA analysis, an increasingly popular technique for cracking stale cases. By comparing DNA from the crime scene with genetic databases that are accessible to the general public, this technology may be able to identify familial links. The use of genetic DNA analysis has been crucial in identifying suspects in cases that have languished unsolved for many years. When Maine resident Stephen Downs became the main suspect, the investigation took a significant shift. Subsequent inquiry showed that Downs was living in the dorm where Sophie was tragically murdered while attending the University of Alaska Fairbanks at the time of the brutal attack. Downs was detained even though he denied having any relationship to Sergie during his 2019 interrogation. This was because his DNA unmistakably matched the sample taken from Sergie's remains decades earlier. Later, he was extradited from Maine, where he was employed as a nurse. Prosecutors built a strong case against Downs by gathering evidence during the trial that connected him to the location of the crime. Important witnesses, such as Vanessa Allen and Jennifer Roy, gave compelling testimony about what happened the night of the attack and gave important insights into what transpired. The main focus of the trial was piecing together Sophie's tragic death by using the memories of people who were in Bartlett Hall on that fatal night. The pursuit of justice for Sophie Sergie and her grieving family was aided greatly by the testimony of witnesses and the developments in forensic technology. When the trial finally came to an end, Stephen Downs was given a sentence of 75 years in jail for the attack that claimed Sophie Sergie's life. The horrific death of Sophie has left a lasting impact, even though justice has been delivered. The tragic events of 1993 altered her friends' and family's life forever, even though they were able to find closure almost 3 decades later. The path from an unsolved cold case to Stephen Downs' capture and conviction serves as an example of how genetic genealogy may be revolutionary in providing victims with justice and comfort to bereaved families. Moving on to the next case. Crystal Lynn Beslanow. A young woman named Tracy Beslanow informed her partner Chris on December 4, 1955, that she was heading to the nearby Circle K for dinner. But Chris started to worry when she didn't get home by 11 p.m. It wasn't as though Tracy had abandoned ship. She was always in contact with her boyfriend. Chris, despite his being, did not phone the police right away. Rather, he went around to neighbors' doors and knocked on them to see if Tracy was there, but she wasn't there. At 8:40 a.m. the following day, a rancher and his son discovered a young woman's nude body 45 miles from Salt Lake City on the banks of the Provo River in Northfield, close to Midway. The case was quickly taken up by the local police department. Though not much was discovered, a pair of socks was discovered carefully folded on a rock. The forensics team also gathered a number of huge, bloody boulders from the area that they thought might have been used as murder weapons. Authorities believe they had a Jane Doe on their hands because the body was found without any clothing or other personal items, such as identification. They did, however, have one benefit. They drew out the many tattoos of the unnamed victim in the hopes that someone would come forward after seeing them on the television. The strategy was successful. Chris called the police as soon as he realized the tattoos were to his girlfriend Tracy. But nothing was what it seemed. After Tracy's father was contacted by the police, he disclosed his suspicions that Jane Doe was actually his 17-year-old stepdaughter, Crystal, who frequently assumed her sister's identity. When Crystal and Chris made the decision to move in together, they had been dating for a little more than a year. The pair had been staying in a motel as they saved up enough cash to move into a more permanent residence. At the age of 15, Crystal's mother, Lindy Thorson, revealed that her daughter had started using drugs and engaging in sex work. She also mentioned that Crystal always had her arms wide open and a big smile on her face when she returned home. "I never turned her down. I have always cherished her." The revelation that Crystal's body, not Tracy's, was found dead made Chris the top suspect in the eyes of the police. He was, after all, Crystal's boyfriend, the one who had revealed her identity as Tracy. Very strange actions for a defenseless man, but there was a catch. Chris did not have the motivation or resources to carry out this horrifying execution. As the household's primary provider, Crystal gave Chris financial support. It didn't seem possible that he could have traveled the great distance to the location of the dead woman's discovery because he didn't own a car either. 3 days later, when authorities learned about a taxi driver named Herb Fry who was well known for his obsession with Crystal, they believed they had hit gold. According to reports, he even said, "Nobody can have her if I can't." But there was also no proof connecting him to the crime. As the years went by, the investigation became less active, but investigators never forgot about Crystal. Detective Todd Bonner, who initially worked the case, said that it followed him for the rest of his career. By 2008, new methods had enabled forensic experts to extract Crystal's DNA from rocks discovered near her body, and the murder weapons also included traces of an unidentified guy. Neither Herb Fry nor Chris could have matched it. Then, in 2013, after 5 years, a brand new DNA tool was made accessible. Authorities were able to extract a complete DNA profile from the pebbles discovered at the scene by using the MVAC on them. The cops received a hit after running the profile through Cody's. Joseph Michael Simpson's DNA was found in the sample. Law enforcement watched Simpson for several days until he threw away a cigarette, which allowed them to positively identify him as their perpetrator. That following year, Todd Bonner, who is currently the county sheriff, followed down the criminal and traced him down to Florida so he could be handcuffed. Simpson had a colorful criminal past that included multiple drug-related charges. The most noteworthy aspect, though, is that he was only granted parole 8 months prior to this after serving a murder sentence. He had been detained since 1987 and had served 8 years in prison for the offense. Simpson was found guilty on September 29, 2016, of killing Crystal Beslanow. Without the possibility of release, he was sentenced to life in jail. Nothing can ever fully ease the anguish of losing a child and a brother, but at least justice was served, and the killer who almost got away with it is now permanently removed from society. Moving on to the next case. Linda Slayton. Linda Slayton, age 31, resided in Lakeland, Florida. Tim, who was 12, and Jeff, who was 15, were her 2 boys. Judy Butler, Linda's sister, had come to their house early on September 4, 1981, so the two could have coffee. Judy, however, discovered her sister's body when she got there and immediately dialed 911. Linda was lying on the bed, her neck encircled with a wire hanger. She had been choked and beaten. Her 2 sons had to hear the news from the investigators when they got on the site. When they discovered Jeff dozing off in the living room, they told him to get dressed and head outside. After stepping outdoors, Jeff noticed television crews, what appeared to be every Florida police officer, and his Aunt Judy, who was sobbing. Judy then informed him of Linda's situation. An officer woke up Tim, Linda's other son, in the second bedroom. Tim walked by his mother's closed bedroom door, still in his pajamas. Then a cop emerged from the room and the door sprang open, and he observed the entire scene of the crime. Investigators surmised that the culprit had broken through the screen and entered Linda's bedroom window. On the windowsill, they discovered a palm print as well. In addition, they extracted DNA from her body that belonged to an unidentified guy. Subsequently, detectives made an effort to find out more about Linda in order to determine whether or not her acquaintance was the culprit. Frank Slayton, Linda's ex-husband, was examined. When she was 24 years old, in 1974, she filed for divorce. Being a violent drunk, he would become aggressive and strike Linda. He was an asshole, but investigators were unable to connect him to the crime. Jeff Slayton was another person that investigators examined. They conducted several interviews with him, but were unable to establish his guilt either. Investigators investigated Joe Mills as well. Tim's high school football coach was Mills, a 20-year-old. Following her divorce, Linda found it difficult to find employment, sewn her own clothes to save money, and was unable to purchase a car. Then, each day, Mills drove Tim to and from practice. Mills was also unconnected to the crime scene by the investigators. As a fingerprint expert, Sergeant Edgar Pickett was employed by the Lakeland Police Department. It was he who searched the whole crime scene and discovered the palm print on the windowsill. The DNA and palm print extracted from Linda's body were preserved for potential use in the future. Tim and Jeff moved in with Clarence and Margaret Harris, their grandparents. They hardly ever left the house because they were so afraid. Except for Grandpa Harris, they were all sleeping in the same room. He would keep watch over them all night long while brandishing a rifle. The grandparents hoped that their distressed grandsons would feel better quickly and get back into regular habits. Grandsons. After their mother's funeral, the boys returned to school a few weeks later. They chose to concentrate on football. A month after Linda was killed, this picture of Tim's football squad was taken. The picture was hung in Tim's bedroom. He claimed it brought to mind what his mother had taught him, to never give up and to keep going forward. Jeff and Tim have revealed in the past few years that they are still grieving and feeling guilty for not hearing anything that night and for not saving their mother. Investigators have created a complete DNA profile of the individual who killed Linda in March 1999. A match was all that was required. In 2001, Detective Brad Grice took up the case. He obtained numerous DNA samples from previously identified individuals of interest and sent them to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for comparative analysis. Tim and Jeff then had a meeting with Detective Grice. To clear the brothers once more, he obtained DNA samples from them. In addition, he assured them he wouldn't leave his position until their mother's case was resolved. Another volunteer was Frank Slayton, who had given up alcohol, but none of the samples matched. Then, in September 2001, a tip came in to investigator Grice. A 24-year-old guy called Jimmy Ulmer almost killed a 10-year-old girl by pulling her through her bedroom window about a year after Linda was taken. Ulmer was found guilty of it and given an 80-year prison term. The brutal attack felt a lot like Linda's experience. Detective Grice also learned that Jimmy Ulmer had been visiting a friend who also happened to reside in Linda's flat building at the time of Linda's death. Detective Grice was certain that they had their man, as were Jeff and Tim. Ulmer died in prison in 1996, but his mother gave Grice a sample of his DNA. It was a huge letdown when his DNA did not match the DNA from the crime scene. They seemed to be going back to the beginning. When investigator Grice took over a new cold case team in 2005, he persuaded the FBI to constantly scan the DNA profile through all federal data repositories. However, the years went by without a match. Detective Grice was unable to fulfill his commitment because he had to retire in 2015 due to health issues. But there was still hope when in 2018, revolutionary DNA technology started to excite the police force. Cece Moore, a genetic genealogist, chose to take up Linda's case. In the subject of investigative genetic genealogy, she is a well-known authority. Cece is the reason behind the resolution of numerous unsolved cases. Moore posted the DNA profile on the open genealogical platform GEDmatch. Then she painstakingly built the culprit's family tree, branch by branch. She filled in the names on the family tree by poring over marriage licenses, birth certificates, obituaries, and social media posts. According to Moore, her investigation revealed 3 strands of the offender's family tree, which finally led her to the one individual who was probably in charge. According to her, the 3 genetic networks combined to form a single family tree that pointed to a single direct family. Since he was the only son in the family, the dad had to have contributed DNA. In a single weekend, Cece Moore was able to identify the man following hundreds of leads, dead ends, and the investigation and clearance of several suspicions. Tim's driver for practice was a man named Joseph Clinton Mills, also known as Coach Joe. Before informing the brothers, the authorities wanted to make sure. Joseph Mills, who was then 58 years old, was living in Kathleen, Florida, roughly 30 minutes away from the crime scene, according to Cece Moore's final 2019 report. On Linda's investigation were 2 of the next generation of Lakeland investigators, Detectives Tammy Hathcock and Russell Hurley. After looking over the initial case files, the police discovered that Mills had been interrogated at first, although for a short time. Mills informed them that he had dropped Tim off at his house and was unaware of Linda's whereabouts. Mills was found guilty in 1984 of grand theft for faking a will, according to detectives. Although he was never arrested, he was fingerprinted and had his palm print taken. Investigators compared those prints, taken in August 2019, to the palm prints Sergeant Pickett had removed from Linda's windowsill almost 38 years earlier. A match was made. Mills was determined to be the most likely offender using advanced genetic genealogy, and his identification was further confirmed by a traditional palm print. Hurley and Detective Hathcock still had to match Mills' recent DNA sample to the decades-old DNA found at the crime scene. They returned Mills' trash to the police department in secret. After finding a piece of old medical adhesive tape, they sent it to the crime lab of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement to be tested. When the test results were received 11 days later, it was determined that Joseph Mills was the one who killed Linda Slayton. It was only then that she could tell her sons Jeff and Tim that the monster had, at last, been captured. Tim expressed his admiration for Coach Joe and expressed his dismay at having this old picture of him. What was even more abhorrent was the fact that Mills kept on driving Tim to and from practice even after he killed Linda. Joseph Mills was apprehended by detectives on December 12, 2019. Detective Tammy Hathcock reading him his rights is shown in this photo. It was almost as if he already knew why he was being arrested because he displayed no emotion and made no inquiry. Following the arrest, Tim and Jeff went to personally thank Sergeant Edgar Pickett, who is currently 94 years old, for taking the palm print all those years ago. Mills entered a guilty plea to all charges in 2022. Linda's family asked why he was sentenced. "Why?" Jeff shouted at him in court. "Joe, I simply want to know why. How come you stole my mother from me? I cherished my mother. We were content." All were enraged at Mills's reaction. "I'm a decent person. I'm not the person they have me portraying myself as." Ultimately, Mills received a life sentence without the chance of release in February 2022. "We owe those early crime scene investigators a great debt of gratitude," stated Cece Moore. "Since they were unaware that DNA will be utilized in criminal investigations when this crime was committed, it is crucial that they gathered that, and that department has kept it safe and responsible for all these years. We couldn't have completed our work if that hadn't occurred." According to Jeff and Tim, they're resolved to do the best they can go on and lead fulfilling lives for their mother and their families. The brothers are also aware that without one another, they could not have made it through their tragedy. Living only a few miles away, they maintain an unwavering closeness and share a passion for restoration cars. Jeff and Tim light a candle next to a picture of their mother on her birthdays and frequently go to her grave together. Charles Walton. On May 12, 1870, Charles and Emma Walton had a son, Charles Walton. He was a laborer in agriculture who had spent his whole life in the civil parish of Lower Quinton, Warwickshire, England. After losing his wife in 1927, Charles was left a widower in 1945 and shared a home with his 33-year-old niece, Edith Isabel Walton. Charles had taken her in when her mother died in 1915, when she was just 3 years old. Charles was seen as an eccentric and reclusive man, but he was also well-liked by many, who said he was courteous and nice. He made a name for himself as a guy who got along well with both horses and dogs. Although he didn't actively interact and was a little introverted, he didn't have any grudges or ill will toward anyone in the town. Before his death in February of 1905, he had been employed for the last 9 months by a nearby farmer named Alfred Potter. Because of his health, Charles worked the farm when it wasn't raining and chose his own hours. He had arthritis. He frequently worked 4 days a week. Charles went out as usual on Valentine's Day, 1945, with his slash hook and pitchfork. Between 9 and 9:30 a.m., witnesses saw him walk past the churchyard. Charles's work on this particular day was to trim hedges in a field on the slopes of Meehan Hill known as Hill Ground. In the meantime, Edith, his niece, was employed at the Royal Society of Arts as a printer-assembler. She anticipated Charles arriving home at 5 p.m., but Edith soon discovered her uncle wasn't there when she got home at 6. She did not think Charles was just hanging out at the bar or with a friend, not considering his reclusive nature. So she proceeded to her neighbor's house next door, and the two of them traveled to the farm where Charles was employed. Edith was informed by Alfred Potter, Charles's boss, that he had witnessed her uncle cutting the hedges that day. After arriving at the location where Potter had last seen his employee, the three found the mangled body of 74-year-old Charles Walton. Edith was so horrified by the sight that her neighbor had to drag her away. While Alfred Potter stood to watch the body until police arrived, another man who was passing was asked to notify the authorities. This was a grisly crime scene. Charles sustained injuries to his neck from the slash hook after being battered with his own walking cane. The firearm remains embedded in the injuries. He was pinned to the ground by the pitchfork's tines on both sides of his neck. There was a rip in his shirt. His pants were not secured, and his fly was ajar. Although the coroner's records make no mention of it, several sources about the case also claim that a cross was cut into his chest. It was a long wait for the authorities. Members of the Stratford-upon-Avon CID did not show up until much later, even though P.C. Lomasney, the first police officer on the site, arrived at 7:05 p.m. It wasn't until 11:30 p.m. when West Midlands Forensic Laboratory Professor Webster arrived. It was not until 1:30 in the morning that Charles's body was removed from the field. Potter was questioned by officials the next day. He said that although Charles had just recently started working for him for the past 9 months, he had known Charles for the entire 5 years that he had lived on the farm. He disclosed to the authorities Charles's routine of eating lunch at 11 a.m. and working until 4 p.m. On February 14th, Potter had spent the morning with another farmer in the neighborhood bar, the College Arms, until midday. The police soon asked Scotland Yard for assistance. They think the culprit may have been one of the prisoners detained in the nearby Italian and German prison camp established at the beginning of the war. Therefore, they asked to bring an Italian interpreter. To help in the investigation, Scotland Yard dispatched Detective Sergeant Albert Webb and Chief Inspector Robert Fabian. The two came on February 16th with D.S. Sanders, who could speak Italian well. Alfred Potter was soon the main suspect in the detectives' eyes. The first policeman on the scene, who was familiar with the Potters, was advised to keep a careful check on the couple in case they said or did anything that might implicate them. At the nearby camp, which was more like a free-roam prison where inmates came and went as they pleased, Sanders, meantime, questioned a few of the Italians. None of the men there, meanwhile, ever developed into credible suspicions. Charles had many broken ribs, bruises across his chest, and a cut trachea, according to the post-mortem examination. In addition, he sustained cuts to his left hand, bruises on the back of his right hand, and forearm from defensive wounds. It was estimated that he passed sometime between 1 and 2 p.m. Potter was informed by Plummerson a few days later on February 20th that the police were seeking to obtain fingerprints from the firearms. In response, Potter said he had handled the guns and reported this to the authorities. Because Edith's neighbor Harry Beasley had instructed him to make sure Charles was dead, he had touched them. Additionally, Potter informed P.C. Lomesny that a fascist member from the camp was responsible for Charles's murder. Potter and his wife were ecstatic when a serviceman showed up at the farm a little while later to inform them that an Italian had been taken into custody by military police. Something the PC was quite suspicious of. More than 500 people who live in Lower Quinton provided statements to authorities. Additionally, they summoned in Royal Engineers who searched the area with mine detectors in an effort to locate Charles's missing pocket watch. Authorities had sent out a description of his pocket watch to pawnbrokers and jewelers the day after his body was discovered, but it was never found. Using the mine detectors, no hints turned up. For a number of reasons, Chief Inspector Robert Fabian thought Alfred Potter was the offender. Just as the cops were drawing near, Potter departed the scene of the crime. P.C. Lomesny thought that although he had earlier complained about the cold, his appearance was more concerned and nervous than anything else. Potter further stated that on the day of Charles's death, he would have visited the man, but he had to tend to a calf that had become stranded in a nearby ditch. But the calf had actually passed away the day before Charles attacked, as the authorities discovered. Additionally, Potter had given multiple accounts of when he'd last seen Charles at work, and each account was different. He stated that he had seen him working at a distance at 12:10, then 12:15, then 12:20, and finally at 12:30 p.m. that he had seen someone. It was also observed by law enforcement that there were no notes regarding him indicating that he had handled the firearms. It was evident that Charles was dead, and Harry Beasley denied charges that he'd told Potter to find out. He clarified that Potter did not come into contact with the guns while he was there. In spite of this knowledge, the authorities were unable to identify a true motivation and did not find any conclusive proof that would have been detrimental. Two of Potter's former employees claimed that he occasionally had trouble paying their salaries, which led others to speculate that Potter and Charles might have been at odds over money. Edith said to the authorities that she had not seen any IOUs and had not heard Charles claim to have lent money to anyone. The investigators reached a dead end since there was no proof to support the claim that Charles was owed money or that there was a disagreement between him and his employer. There have always been many stories of witchcraft and paganism in Lower Quinton Hamlet. The devil allegedly tried to smother the town's recently constructed abbey with a big clod of earth, but the Bishop of Worcester saw him coming and used prayer to change the devil's trajectory, causing the earth to miss the abbey and form Meehan Hill, the exact location where Charles's body was discovered. Stories like these were still common in 1945, as they had been in earlier ages. Just a year prior to Charles Walton's murder, Helen Duncan, a lady who claimed to be able to call spirits, was on trial in Lower Quinton for violating the 17/30/5 Witchcraft Act. Charles had been the subject of rumors for a while before to his passing. A few people were wary of him since they thought he had ruined the harvest the year before by using toads, while others pointed out his strange bond with animals. The whispering indicated that Charles could tame wild beasts, and that the birds would feed from his hand and refrain from eating the seeds from his land at his request. We have already talked about Charles's affection for dogs and horses. A Charles Walton was described in the 1929 book Folklore, Old Customs and Traditions in Shakespeareland as having witnessed a phantom black dog on the road while walking home on multiple occasions in 1885. He'd seen the dog with a headless woman on the last night. When he got home, he discovered that his sister was dead. For a very long time, black dogs have been associated with death and Satan in British legend. It is noted, meanwhile, that no documentation exists indicating Charles had a sister who passed away in 1885. When Chief Inspector Robert Fabian wrote his autobiography in the 1970s, he called the Charles Walton case the witchcraft murder and stated that it was unmistakably the spectral culmination of a paganism ritual. He added that one evening on Meehan Hill, he had an encounter with a black dog. Unsubstantiated reports exist regarding the presence of a black dog hanged up near to Charles's body. A vicious murder occurred in 1875 on an 80-year-old Long Compton resident named Tennant, 15 miles from Lower Quinton. Though this has subsequently been refuted, there is a rumor that she was killed in the same way that Charles was. Although Anne's case also involved the use of a pitchfork, that is where the similarities between the two incidents end, and was murdered in front of multiple witnesses by a guy called James Hayward, who claimed she was a witch. When a BBC reporter in 2014 inquired about Charles's case with Lower Quinton inhabitants, they allegedly encountered a reaction from the community. The villagers' stiff lips were apparent to them. The owner of the College Arms, the bar where Potter had been drinking on February 14, 1945, said to the reporter that discussing it would just agitate people and that it would be counterproductive to cause division in such a tiny community. He also mentioned that there is always someone who knows something in situations like this. Someone knows what goes on, but nobody will talk about it to protect the feelings of family members and to avoid worrying others. Charles's missing pocket watch was found in his outhouse in 1960. The outhouse had been searched extensively in the weeks following Charles's death, which led authorities to surmise that the murderer had returned it for some reason. The horrifying murder of Charles Walton is still unsolved as of right now. Moving on to the next case. Mitrice Richardson. Born on April 30, 1985, to Ladis Sutton and Michael Richardson, Mitrice Richardson is a bright and successful young lady. The turbulent relationship between the pair finally resulted in their breakup. Furthermore, Mitrice was reared primarily in Covina, California, by her mother and stepfather, Larry Sutton. Mitrice attended South Hills High School and graduated with honors. In 2008, he attended California State University in Fullerton and earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in psychology. She worked part-time as an attendant at an LGBTQ+ strip club and as an intern for a forensic psychologist in the year 2009. Some stories state that Mitrice had broken up with her 2-year girlfriend when she vanished. When 24-year-old Mitrice walked into Jeffrey's restaurant in Malibu on September 16, 2009, she started acting strangely, according to the staff, as she was eating a steak and sipping a martini. She made an attempt to join a nearby table where people were chatting incoherently about astrological signs. After that, she went back to her own seat to finish her meal, but she later came back to the table to tell everyone that she was going to Hawaii and would get in touch with them when she got there. The party that thought her strange but not unpleasant or bothersome departed shortly after. When Mitrice tried to leave as well, the manager stopped her and asked her how she planned to pay her $89 charge. Mitrice insisted that the group ought to have covered her expenses, but the employees refuted her assertion. The 24-year-old then mentioned that she was from the planet Mars and that she should use sex to pay off her debt. Mitrice took a joint and emptied her pockets, searching for whatever cash she could have on her person. She sounds pretty weird. So the restaurant workers phoned the cops at this point. There's a chance she's high. After receiving the call, the LA County Sheriff's Department determined her status. They found that she was not inebriated or under the effect of drugs after giving her a sobriety test. After that, Mitrice was taken into custody on suspicion of not paying for the dinner and of having less than 1 ounce of marijuana in his hands. Before they departed the scene, the arresting cop said that the 24-year-old had locked her car with her belongings, including her purse, cell phone, and cash. Next, the vehicle was transported along the Pacific Coast Highway to a tow yard. About 10 miles up Malibu Canyon, at the Lost Hills Sheriff Station, Mitrice was taken into custody and given literature. Mitrice made 4 attempts to phone her great-grandmother after being arrested. She had committed the number to memory alone. Although Mitrice informed the police that the phone never rang, the cops claimed to have heard her conversing. It is impossible to determine who was right in this situation because the usual pay phone that was being used had malfunctioned. Thus, the calls were placed on a non-recording line. Mitrice's mother was extremely worried when she learned that her daughter had been imprisoned. The 24-year-old was informed by station personnel that he would not be allowed outside until the morning. But that's not what actually happened. Mitrice was released at 12:28 a.m. She was alone in a place she didn't know, without any of her belongings, and without a way to return home. She was freed because, according to a police spokeswoman, she showed no indications of being drunk or mentally sick. It is also said that the young woman refused to wait in the lobby. Bill Smith, a former news anchor, noticed the 24-year-old in his garden around 6:30 a.m., some hours later. Smith lived in Monternito, a community of equestrian estates and private hiking trails located approximately 6 miles west of the Lost Hills Station at the base of Dark Canyon. Mitrice informed Smith that she was sleeping when he opened his window to check on her. After that, he phoned the police, but by the time they got there, the 24-year-old had left. Officers at the station advised her to wait a few more hours before reporting her missing, even though her mother realized right away that something was wrong. Mitrice was not the subject of a be on the lookout alert until early in the afternoon on the 17th. However, Mitrice vanished from sight, and in the months that followed, no sign of her was found. When her family tried to retrieve the tape from her detention cell after she vanished, LASD Captain Thomas Martin informed them that none existed. There isn't any form of videotape. Later on, he would tell the press. But 4 months later, in January 2010, Martin acknowledged that the recording did, in fact, exist. His desk drawer had it. Interestingly, the captain was promoted and sent to a station more than an hour distant by the end of that month. It took an additional 3 months for the family to finally watch the videotape. The police said that this was because of technological lag. Lattice remembered observing the video and noticing that her daughter appeared restless and upset. The family claimed that the tape had been altered. They were left wondering what was omitted from the original recording as a result. According to reports, Mitrice was spotted carrying a piece of paper 1 second and crumpled on the ground the next. The LASD never provided an explanation for the video's editing. But during the course of the inquiry into Mitrice's abduction and eventual death, the police conducted a number of strange and suspicious acts, of which this episode was just one. The family saw Mitrice depart the station 2 minutes after she did, from a different door, when they watched more footage of her. However, no one at the LASD would give the man's name. Naturally, Michael, Mitrice's father, said, "That makes me suspect. My daughter is the one who leaves the building first, and they don't say anything about him. He may have taken her hostage, offered to drive her to the impound lots, abandoned her, and then returned to get her. Perhaps he missed her. Why have they been hiding him is the key question. It is their responsibility to uncover the facts and get off their donut-eating asses." Mike Kessler, a journalist for LA Magazine, was able to find out who this cop was. It appears that the individual was moved less than 6 months after Mitrice's family saw the video of him leaving the building. The man said, "Unfortunately for you, dude, I wasn't there," when Kessler approached him. After that, he hung up. But Kessler persisted, and he was able to talk to the officer once again. This time, the individual insisted he had no memory of being at the department that evening. He said to Kessler, quote, I was one of the guys that kept away from this, minding my own business. The night this nonsense happened, the LASD conducted a search on January 9, 2010. In the department's history, it was one of the most extensive searches. More than 300 individuals with search and rescue training took part in an 18-square-mile exploration of Malibu Canyon. The volunteers searched both on the ground and in the air, going over ridges, trails, and creeks. More searches were conducted later that year on June 5th and 6th, with the participation of over 100 private citizen volunteers. Still, searchers were unable to locate Mitrice. On August 9, 2010, just after noon, rangers in Dark Canyon were investigating a marijuana farm that had just been cleared by the police when they came upon Mitrice's body. The terrain was densely covered with poison oak, difficult stones, and other unpleasant plant debris, and there were no designated footpaths. The corpse of Mitrice was lying above a creek bed. Her body looked mummified. The police were promptly contacted by the rangers. A deputy from Lost Hills showed up at the site about 1:30 p.m. Despite the fact that the coroner should have been notified right away, it was almost 3 p.m. when he was contacted. The coroner was dispatched to the Lost Hills station at approximately 5 o'clock in the evening to await an airlift from a point above the canyon, and 2 investigators were transported to the crime scene around 5:20 p.m. 1 hour and 40 minutes more went on as the coroner waited for the chopper. Later, the police announced that the airlift had been postponed while the helicopter assisted in the hunt for a hiker who had gone missing. Detectives gathered Mitrice's remains at 8 p.m. as the sun was setting and had them transported back to the station. The state code in question, which said that a body could not be disturbed or removed from the location of death without the consent of the coroner or the coroner's designated deputy, and the assistant chief coroner Ed Winter's instructions were disregarded in this case. The LASD had access to the remains for more than 6.5 hours in total before deciding to transport them without the coroner's permission. In an interview with LA Magazine, a former LAPD officer stated rather frankly that removing the body from the scene without the coroner's consent was, quote, ass backwards. It is the responsibility of law enforcement to safeguard the crime scene, he said. A body should never be moved without consent. The coroner received the photos that the rangers who had initially discovered the body had taken. Although they have never been made public, Mitrice's right leg was 2 yards upslope from her body, according to a source close to the investigation who spoke with reporter Mike Kessler of LA Magazine. There was a tunnel through the soft tissue where the femur bone had been removed, as though it had been yanked out rather than by animals. It was really rather strange. The fact that one of her arms was arranged so that it defied gravity and had likely been left so for some time after her death added to the bizarreness of the image. Claire Koff, a forensic anthropologist, has proposed that this was caused by Mitrice's body being covered with something after she passed away. But there were going to be more strange revelations. The coroner's employee authorized Dan McElderry and Kevin Acevedo, the LASD detectives on the scene, to move the skull and examine what was underneath, according to Lieutenant Michael Rawson, who oversaw the investigators on their behalf. According to Rawson, the head was attached and, quote, the entire skeleton is still in place together with the skull. This, allegedly, isn't what the images of the crime scene depict. It is clear from the photos that the skull had already been cut away from the body. Its mandible was missing from its upper torso, and it was resting upside down. Moreover, when the body was relocated, 5 neck bones were absent. They've never been located. Whether Rawson and Captain David Smith, who corroborated his account, were present when the body was transferred is uncertain. The detectives and other officers present at the incident have not been made available for comment. When Mike Kessler emailed asking for feedback, Lost Hills Captain Joseph Stephen responded, saying, "Please do not contact the staff. Your repeated attempts to harass my workers are getting increasingly concerning, and they need to stop right away. We are unable and unwilling to talk to you about this situation." The LASD spokeswoman stated that the agency feels uneasy when journalists get in touch with them and that they have nothing at all to conceal. Even though Mitrice's case was unusual overall, the LASD did not think that a crime had been committed. It was claimed that she might have been allergic to poison oak and experienced an acute response, or that she might have ventured into the region and become one of the 2 individuals in California who die every year from wounds caused by rattlesnakes. They also said that the 24-year-old's clothes had been stolen by animals. The only items she had left close to her body were her trousers, belts, and bra. If the animals had indeed taken her clothes, then they must have also taken off her shoes, unbuckled her belts, yanked it out of the jeans loops, and dragged down her underwear and pants. The list is endless and doesn't seem to hold up. Another officer proposed that the water's currents had taken off her clothes. However, this still doesn't explain why her belt fell loose from her jeans or why her bra unhooked. In addition, if this were the case, the body would have been deposited where it was on the slope above the creek by the water rising 60 feet above the creek bed and pushing it against the river. In this case, another unanswered question is how Mitrice's remains ended up partially mummified. How in the heat had they not broken down completely? Her physique ought to have been reduced to a skeleton after 11 months. When a body is mummified, it usually means that it was placed in sub-zero or extremely dry conditions as soon as possible after death and left there for an extended amount of time. The naked body of a woman who you know was in a vulnerable situation within 2 miles of where she was last seen in an area with which she had no competence in an unexplainable position is in your possession, said forensic anthropologist Claire Koff, who noted Mitrice's positioned arm and informed LA Magazine. In most cases, you would assume that this is a homicide until you can rule it out. She was, on the surface, dead. It sounds like she was kidnapped, killed, and then her corpse was dumped. But Lee Backer, the LASD sheriff at the time, didn't think so. At a press conference, he said, "At this time, there is no indication of a homicide. The remains, in my opinion, are not able to tell us a story." Considering that the coroner's office also seems to have been careless in its duties, this seems like a particularly strange thing to say. The hair that was discovered on the ground next to Mitrice's body was not examined. It's unknown if the 24-year-old owns it or if someone else gave it to her. In addition, some sort of metallic debris and an earring that Mitrice had not been wearing were discovered in her scalp hair, though neither item was examined. Despite the discovery of bug egg casings on the remains, the casings were not investigated further. It's unclear if they originated from an indigenous bug that frequented the region or if they traveled elsewhere. Mitrice's clothing and the plants surrounding her were not checked for signs of trauma, and neither her brain nor her skull were thoroughly inspected for foreign DNA or semen. Her pubic hair was also not tested for these substances. Although the 24-year-old's teeth were claimed to have turned pink, indicating a possible strangulation, this was not verified because the hyoid bone, along with the previously mentioned other neck bones, was still missing. 6 months after the body was discovered, the location was examined once more, but not since. In the months following Mitrice's passing, friends and family visited the spot to erect a memorial and discovered one of her fingers. Sheriff Backer declared in December 2010 that the FBI was going to inspect Mitrice's remains. But it soon became clear that, before Backer's announcement, they had never agreed to do this and had not planned to do so. Even yet, on July 13, 2011, the body was dug up and brought to the LASD crime lab. Nevertheless, it is unknown what was discovered during this inspection. It seems like anything might happen in a scenario this bizarre. Mitrice might have lost her mind and wandered into the woods, or there might be a darker plot underway. Maybe there's more to this story than the cops trying to hide the fact that they failed to act appropriately and were in charge of a mentally ill young woman. Mitrice was bipolar and had not slept for 5 days when she vanished, according to evidence found in her diary and text messages. When she was released from the Lost Hills station that September night, She was probably in excruciating pain. Latice, the mother of the 24-year-old, thinks she was the victim of foul play. She said that Mitrice is not a hiker. My daughter lives in the city. She didn't stray into that ravine. I think someone used her mental illness, which she was experiencing. She was, in my opinion, slain, possibly raped, and then dumped. No action was taken against the LASD after an independent inquiry of their handling of the matter found that they had acted improperly. But after Mitrice's body was found, her parents filed a lawsuit against the LASD for letting the girl go. Every one of them got $450,000. The matter of Mitrice remains unresolved, and the $10,000 award was just renewed. The LASD's number to report information regarding Mitrice's death is 213-229-1700. Madeleine McCann. After Madeleine vanished 13 years ago, there was truly little chance that her case would ever be resolved. Then, on June 3, 2020, a shocking revelation was made by British and German investigators. In an instant, the case was once again in the news. They declared that a German guy was being looked into for maybe killing Madeleine. At first, they made an effort to conceal the identity of the individual, but it was soon revealed. German media reports identified the suspect as 43-year-old Christian B. From 1995 till 2007, he resided in the Algarve region of Portugal. In Germany, Christian B. is presently serving a term for unrelated offenses. Soon after, more details became available. They displayed the two cars he was driving when she vanished. First, a Jaguar sedan and a Volkswagen camper van. They made an appeal for anyone with knowledge to come forward. Sadly, the German police also declared that they now think Madeleine is dead based on the evidence they have. Nonetheless, the British police continue to refer to it as a missing persons case. Her family is still holding out hope for her survival. It was also made known that Christian B.'s cell phone was found quite close to Madeleine's location on the night of her disappearance. Christian B. registered his Jaguar automobile under a different name the following day. Even while it might just be a coincidence, it's still noteworthy. We were able to determine that an hour prior to her disappearance, Christian B. received a call using his cell phone. For 30 minutes, the call went on. You can see the number I called him at as well as his phone number here. When the police first noticed Christian B. asking questions in a chat forum regarding Madeleine's abduction, they began to investigate him. Christian B., who was residing in the Algarve, supported himself by theft. According to German police theory, he may have broken into Madeleine's flat to steal something before deciding to kidnap her. Many people will wonder why it took 13 years for this information to become public. Because Christian B. was investigated once again, the Portuguese police really looked into him back in 2008 years ago. Christian B. was investigated once more. According to what the witness told police, he allegedly told someone at a pub about how he killed Madeleine and buried her somewhere. Christian B. also discussed his role in other incidents. He was found guilty of those crimes and is presently serving a jail sentence. Then it was made public that Christian Brechner is the suspect's full name. In 2007, he relocated to Hanover, Germany, leaving the Algarve region. He lived in his shadow, off the grid. During a recent check of the property, the cops discovered a hidden cellar. We don't yet know what's inside the cellar because it happened only a few days ago, and the police haven't released all the details. However, we are aware that certain samples were brought in for examination. Wolfgang Kossack, a man who briefly lived next door to Christian, recalled that Christian had informed him that no one knew he was residing there and that he had not registered with the authorities. Wolfgang also recalled the Christian's camper van that was parked close to his plot. Christian resided in Braunschweig, around 40 miles from Hanover, from 2013 until 2016. He dug a cellar there, too, neighbors of his claimed. The present owner and his neighbors want it to be searched. She might be lying on top of Madeleine McCann, The current owner worries. Christian has told his lawyer that he will never speak to the police, and he has refused to speak with them. Nonetheless, German prosecutors are positive that they have their man and will work to prove him guilty of the crime. The Portuguese media reports that Christian had a female accomplice who assisted him in identifying the best residences to break into, but no concrete evidence was provided and the story is yet unconfirmed. When he was residing at Praia da Luz, not far from the location where Madeleine was abducted, the authorities think he lived in this house. Moving on to the next case. Beast of Jersey. Jersey Island is a member of the Channel Islands, an archipelago in the English Channel that lies between France and England. There were roughly 57,000 people living on the 9-mile-long and 5-mile-wide island in the 1950s. Residents of the island of Jersey were plagued by a serial rapist from the late 1950s to the early 1970s. During his 14-year reign of terror, he would rape and stalk at least 13 victims, going by the moniker, the Beast of Jersey. When a young woman in the Montelab region was being pulled into a field by a man while she was waiting for a bus in November 1957, the fear started. Before tying a rope around her neck, pulling her up to a nearby field, and raping her, the man with the scarf covering his head struck the woman from behind. He left the woman where she was after he raped her and left the scene. Thankfully, the woman was located and brought to a medical facility. In March 1958, the man attacked once more, this time focusing on a 20-year-old lady who was making her way home from a bus stop on foot. He dragged the woman to a field using the same modus operandi, then raped her after putting a rope around her neck. From 1957 to 1959, he would only prey on ladies who were close to bus stations. He assaulted a 31-year-old in July of 1958 and a 28-year-old in October of the same year. The perpetrator was characterized by all the victims as smelling musty. He increased the stakes in 1960 and started attacking people in their homes through break-ins. The man broke into a residence in St. Saveller on Valentine's Day in 1960. A man wearing a mask was seated in the 12-year-old's bedroom when he woke up. The youngster was led outside to a field by the man, who then sexually molested him while tying a rope around his neck. When a man claiming to be a doctor offered to give her a ride in March 1960 while she was waiting for her bus in St. Brelade, she accepted. The man was on his way to pick up his wife. The man attacked her as soon as she got inside the car, bound her, and blindfolded her. After that, he drove to a field close by and sexually assaulted her. The man led her back to the car, but she was able to get away and discovered a couple who lived close by. The assailant had already left when the police were called. A man broke into a secluded property in St. Martin later that month. A 43-year-old woman heard a noise while she was asleep. After switching on the lights, she downed the stairs to look around. The lights went out suddenly as soon as she got to the bottom of the stairs, and she heard movement in the living room. She attempted contacting the police on the neighboring phone, but the connection was dead. There was a cut in the phone line. Without delay, the man chased after her, threatening to kill her and demanding money. The woman's 14-year-old daughter heard the disturbance and went to investigate. After managing to get out of his grasp, the mother instructed her daughter to shut herself in her room. Running to a nearby farmhouse, the woman set off the alarm. The invader had fled before she got back, but not before raping her daughter. He broke into the bedroom of a 14-year-old girl in April. When the girl awoke, the man in the mask had been observing her while she slept. He fled as the girl cried so loudly. An 8-year-old child would be kidnapped from his house in July and brought to a field where he would be raped. After that, the assailant returned to the boy's house and dropped him off at his door. In 1961, he would attack 3 more youngsters. They were all taken from their houses, brought to a field, and sexually assaulted. After more than 3 years of operation, the police still had no leads or suspects in the Beast of Jersey case. Every man on the island was asked to provide their fingerprints, and they interviewed every man with a criminal record. 13 of them, nevertheless, declined to provide their fingerprints. One of them was, it would turn out, the assailant. The victims had stated that the attacker was approximately 40 years old, 5 feet 6 inches tall, and dressed in a long coat, a scarf, or a mask. Each victim described the attacker as speaking with an odd Irish dialect and having a musty smell to him. He would launch attacks from 3 a.m. until 10 p.m. Using a flashlight, he would sneak into houses through windows. Police soon discovered a break in the case. Alphonse Legator-Lewitt, a local, was taken into custody after being suspected of the rapes and attacks. Further than the fact that he was a well-known eccentric, the police had no further evidence against him. He was a recluse who enjoyed taking walks late at night. He had a raincoat, too. After 14 hours of interrogation, the individual was freed because there was insufficient proof. But the harm was already done. Vigilantes set fire to his home after his face appeared prominently in newspapers. Alphonse had to permanently depart from the island. The police decided to ask Scotland Yard for assistance as they had no leads or suspects. Scotland Yard asked residents to establish neighborhood watches and watch out for one another. After a 2-year hiatus, the Beast of Jersey reappeared in 1963. The Beast would attack once more in April 1963 when he kidnapped a 9-year-old boy and brought him to a field where he was sexually assaulted. He then went on to rape 3 more kids before going missing for 2 years in 1964. 2 years later, an anonymous letter purportedly written by the Beast of Jersey was sent to the police. "Dear Sir, I believe that now is the right time to inform you that you are wasting your time," the letter stated. "Remember, it won't end here. I promise to be fair to you and give you another chance. I've never had much in my life, but right now I want to seize every opportunity. My dream has always been to commit the ideal crime. I had already done this, but since it has to be ideal this time, I let the moon shine exceptionally brightly in September. Not 1, but 2. I enjoy to toy with you people, but I'm by no means a fanatic. Before September, you will hear from me, and I'll give you all the hints you need to try to figure out how to capture me. Sincerely yours, just wait and see." A 15-year-old girl would be kidnapped and sexually assaulted in August. But the crime was different this time. The girl's body was covered in lengthy scratches that were evenly spaced out in parallel rows. After this, there would be no attacks for 4 years. August 1970 would see the Beast return. A 14-year-old would be taken from his house and sexually assaulted. The boy reported to the police that the assailant had on a mask. Luckily, the Beast would never put on the mask again, and this would be the last attack. An automobile ran a red light directly in front of 2 police officers who were on duty in center on July 10, 1970, at approximately 11:45 p.m. The officers pursued the automobile because it was being driven erratically. After running down the sidewalk and into a tomato field, the driver ran onto the wrong side of the road, sideswiped several vehicles, and eventually struck a hedge. The motorist attempted to run away, but because the officers were European, they rugby tackled him and took him into custody. The police station was where he was brought. They were able to see the man well under the police station's lights and saw that he was not your typical irresponsible driver. The man had been wearing a long dark coat with shoulder pads, cuffs, and collar protruding from it, along with 1-inch long nails and screws. There was a musty smell about the long coat. The man's socks were tucked into his ancient pants. Police discovered 2 lengths of rope, a woolen cap, empty cigarette packages, a roll of adhesive tape, and a flashlight with tape over most of the bulb, creating a regulated, narrow beam of light within his pockets. Police discovered a mask and a spiky black-haired wig inside his car. The man's face bore tape markings identical to the mask's tape, indicating that he had worn it not long ago. Edward Pennell was recognized as the man. He said he was headed to a sex party and that he had nails through his clothes in case someone there knew martial arts when the cops questioned him. Police discovered an extremely foul-smelling hidden area in his house that was packed with worn-out clothes and homemade wigs. In addition, they discovered a sword, pictures of nearby homes, and an altar full of books about black magic and the occult. In 1925, Edward Pinnell was born. He was incarcerated as a teenager for stealing food to feed families that were going hungry. Other than that, he had no criminal past. He was a construction worker with a spouse and kids. According to his wife Joan, he used to visit her foster home for children disguised as Santa Claus in an attempt to provide festive pleasure. She remembered that the children nicknamed him Uncle Ted. His spouse claimed that she was ignorant of his behavior during their marriage. She added that Pinnell had no desire for sex and that their lives were mostly lived apart. At the time of his arrest, Pinnell was also seeing someone else. Pinnell was tried on November 29, 1971. The jury found him guilty on 13 charges of rape, sexual assault, and sodomy against 6 of his victims in under 48 minutes. He received a 30-year prison sentence. In 1991, Pinnell was granted parole from prison due to his good behavior. In 1994, he went free. Moving on to the next case. Brett Wynn. When Brett William Wynn disappeared in the winter of 1989, he was 24 years old. At the time, he worked as an assistant manager at the nearby grocery Hallett Cove Foodland and was engaged to Carolyn, his longtime girlfriend. In South Australia, the couple resided in the village of Port Noarlunga, which is only 18.5 miles south of Adelaide city centre. On November 16, 1989, at around 8 p.m., Brett entered a white Ford sedan that had come into his driveway. After the car pulled out of the driveway, the two of them left. Carolyn waved him off as she watched, not realizing who the driver was. Brett called Carolyn later that night to let her know he would be returning soon. The 24-year-old never returned that night, so that was the last anyone heard from him. Brett experienced a break-in that same evening at work. The culprits possessed the combination to the safe, had access to the front door via a key, and knew how to turn off the alarm system using an employee PIN code. They took $60,000 from the store by using this. Authorities assumed that Brett was the robber's inside man and that he had fled after stealing the money with his companions because he didn't show up home that evening. The preliminary inquiry into Brett's disappearance is hardly known. The case seemed to have evaporated fast. Things didn't really get going again until 1997, when, in response to a public plea for assistance, police enforcement received a tip from an unidentified source indicating that the 24-year-old hadn't been abducted but had instead been murdered. Because of this, detectives came to the conclusion that Brett was a member of a 3-man gang that may have robbed a number of nearby supermarkets in the months before to his disappearance. They informed police that a man named David was involved before hanging up, but they would not disclose detectives any more details or the man's entire name. 2 years later, 2 males were recognized by law enforcement as potential members of Brett's robbery gang. For legal reasons, the other man's identity has never been made public. However, the first man went by the name David Christopher Cox. Both suspects acknowledged that they knew Brett, but they said that they had no knowledge of his disappearance, that he had been murdered, and that they had nothing to do with the string of robberies that occurred just before the 24-year-old went missing. When authorities were approached again in 2002, a tipster informed them that Brett's body had been moved after it had been initially disposed of approximately an hour away from his home in Cape Jervis by the side of a road. The 24-year-old's body was transferred a few days later to David Cox's residence in Hackham West, which was less than 10 minutes away from Brett's residence. The caller said that they assisted David in moving Kate Jervis's body and that they were a friend of David's. As per the tipster, when they reached David's residence, they found that a grave had been dug beneath the bedroom floorboards. The body was buried after being placed inside a surf bag. Brett's skeleton bones were discovered in a surf bag beneath the bedroom floorboards by investigators who had responded to the tipster's address shortly after they had gotten this contact. The articles concerning his case have not stated the cause of his death. In 2004, 2 years after Brett's death, David Cox faced murder charges. However, David was freed when a jury found him not guilty despite having the anonymous caller's testimony and discovering the body at his former home. His defense said that most prosecution witnesses were unreliable and of low character, pointing out that most of them had significant drug use in 1989 and that some of them had since developed mental health problems. A few years later, David ended his own life. Naomi, Brett's younger sister, believes that justice will ultimately find its way to the other unidentified male who was a member of the heist ring, despite his passing. She said that at first, the family believed Brett had just taken off and would return shortly, saying he just needed some alone time. They were devastated when he didn't. She did, however, tell the Sunday Mail that the finding of his body was helpful. My parents felt a small sense of relief when Brett was discovered. At last, they could lay him to rest and attempt to begin the healing process. For nearly a year following Brett's disappearance, his fiancée Carolyn received weekly food deliveries, which were occasionally paid for by a man she subsequently identified as Cox, according to a Reddit user who also discussed the case. It is said that when she entered into a new relationship, the deliveries stopped. Online rumors suggest that this was done to trick Carolyn into believing Brett was still alive. Though it's unclear exactly what the truth is right now, the case of Brett Wynn remains unresolved. If you're fascinated by true crime and enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up to stay updated on all our latest content. Moving on to the next case. Janette Depalmer. In Jersey City, New Jersey, on August 3, 1956, Janette Christine Depalmer was born. Janette appeared to be a typical middle-class girl, if a little bit devout. She was one of Salvador and Florence Depalmer's 5 daughters, and she hailed from a huge Italian family. She had 3 brothers as well. According to some reports, the family's drug problems were resolved when Janette and her older sister, Gwendolyn, committed to the Church of God. She was rumored to be planning to attend Bible college and to be actively involved in community activities that assisted drug addicts. Janette was regarded as something of a wild youngster by some, while being perceived by others as a girl on the straight and narrow. Some even said that she may not have shared her parents' beliefs or concerns regarding her religious attitude, but rather that it was something they cared about. In August 1972, Janette was 16 years old and employed at a clothes store. She told her mother that she was taking the train to a friend's house when she left her home on Springfield Township, New Jersey's Clearview Road on Monday, the 17th. Her parents reported her missing to the local police station after she failed to return home or show up at her friend's residence that evening. On September 19th, 6 weeks later, a decaying corpse was discovered in Springfield's Quarries Rock Face. The form of the body was found when one of the neighborhood dog Waters pets brought it to its owner. A number of individuals who witnessed the macabre scene stated that odd and potentially esoteric items surrounding the face-down skeleton bones. While witnesses have given varying accounts, the most widely accepted claim is that the body was discovered within a log and branch casket. There were improvised wooden crosses inside this. Some neighbors of Springfield asserted that the body was discovered resting atop a pentagram, around by animal corpses that had been butchered. However, local law enforcement has refuted this assertion. The notion that this murder was connected to witchcraft was strengthened by the fact that the cliff where the body was discovered was nicknamed the Devil's Teeth by the locals for numerous decades. Janette's dental records were used to identify the body as hers. The things she was last seen in, the tan pants, navy blouse, and flip-flops, were still on her. Regretfully, the autopsy did not provide the authorities with much information. There are no visible indications of bone fractures, gunshot, or knife wounds on her body or in her clothing, and no drug paraphernalia was discovered on or around the body. The coroner and other officials were unable to provide an explanation for the unusually high levels of lead discovered in the remains. Although the exact cause of death is unknown, The coroner believed the 16-year-old girl had been strangled, which prompted law enforcement to begin a hurried and, to be honest, insufficient homicide investigation. Police were tipped off about a homeless man who lived in the woods close to Janette's body early on in their investigation into his ruthless murder. Locals called the drifter Red, and they said that after Janette vanished, he left his camp in the woods. Though it seemed that this was a tip worth following up on, the prosecutor's office in Union County soon found that Red was unrelated to Janette's case. How they arrived at this choice is uncertain. Investigators are still looking into the matter in spite of this setback. Still, it wasn't long until the leads stopped coming in. The fact that none of Janette's friends or acquaintances provided reliable information about her lifestyle added to the case's cold case status. Newspapers such as the Star-Ledger and the New York Daily Times started to speculate 2 weeks after Janette's body was discovered that she might have been the victim of a cult sacrifice, a practice that might have been carried out by Satanists or a local coven working in the nearby Watchung Reservation, a nature reserve in Union City, New Jersey. Long after Janette's case went cold, whispers about the Watchung Reservation and rumors about her death persisted. An anonymous letter about Janette's situation started to arrive at Weird NJ magazine in the late 90s and early 2000s. Mark Moran, the editor and co-founder, started looking into the case and recording strange information, such as claims that the Springfield Police Department had misplaced or destroyed the case file. In relation to this, the police department maintained that Hurricane Floyd in 1990 caused flooding, which resulted in the fire. Unknown sources, however, claimed that a copy of the file still existed. Later, Mark Moran collaborated with Jesse Pollock, one of his magazine's correspondents, to create a book about the case. After conducting extensive research, they came to the following conclusions. There was a chance of a cover-up. The case was connected to other unresolved crimes, and there were a number of previously unidentified suspects. No one, not even law enforcement, that the writers contacted for the book was willing to be on record or have their name published, according to an article on the Weird NJ website that covers the case and the book written about it. Locals believe that the murderer was still at large, that the killing was connected to a cult, and that the police were somehow complicit in the crime's cover-up. When Janette's clothes was tested in 1973, her blouse, pants, and underwear turned out to be free of poisons or drugs. No extraneous hairs were discovered either. She did, however, have stains in her bra, pants, top, and underwear, but they were too badly deteriorated to be used for blood or semen exams. Donald Schwartz, the initial patrolman who discovered the body, has stated to media outlets that he doesn't believe in the occult hypothesis and that he thinks Janette died from a heroin overdose. This belief is also held by several internet detectives, who think the case's supernatural overtones were only a red herring. Instances where there is insufficient evidence to support the claims are frequently attributed to so-called occult practices. However, other people, including Janette's nephew, think that someone else caused her death. A Union County judge denied the request in 2019 to analyze Janette's clothing for DNA. A veteran private investigator made this request after suing the Union County Prosecutor's Office in an effort to force them to test the garments. The motion was turned down because the private investigator lacked a legal connection to Depalmer, her estate, or any other parties who would be affected by the case's resolution, making it impossible for him to file a lawsuit. Many people hold out hope that someday answers will be provided to a case that remains cloaked in mystery, like the unsolved mystery surrounding Janette's case. The Sodder children, sweet and innocent children of 1940s West Virginia, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty Sodder were known to their parents and siblings as cherished additions to their huge family. Their carefree kindness and innocent amazement were cut short on Christmas Eve 1945 by mysterious unsolved disappearances, leaving everyone who knew them in West Virginia and around the country searching for answers in a sea of information that left everyone feeling confused and lost. This investigation of the Sodder children's disappearance and the perplexing mystery along State Route 19 aims to offer more substantive reasoning based on visible evidence and situational analysis. Giorgio Soddu was born in Tula, Sardinia, Italy in 1895, marking the start of the Sodder family tradition. After what seemed to be 13 years of upheaval and unidentified disaster, Giorgio came to the United States in 1808. He left behind his Italian heritage and adopted the name George Sodder after traveling to Ellis Island with his older brother and entering his new nation securely. Once George Sodder's younger siblings were formally admitted into the United States, and he was finally freed from Tula's clutches, George's older brother promptly returned to Europe. Throughout the years he had spent living in the United States before, George had always maintained the privacy of his own country. He had never revealed the precise reasons for his decision to leave Italy and travel across the ocean. George looked all over the East Coast for work before straying into the Rust Belt and finding railway work in Pennsylvania. He served as a sort of runner, bringing supplies, food, and other items to his fellow workers. After working at similar jobs for a few years, he saved up money and eventually got a full-time job as a driver in Smithers, West Virginia. As he entered adulthood, he traveled about the Appalachian area. After gaining valuable experience as a heavy-duty driver, George decided to turn his passion into a business and launched his own trucking firm that moved dirt around Appalachia between building sites. After that, this changed to delivering coal from nearby mines located in the West Virginian mountains, and George quickly gained the respect of the community for the Sodder name. Shortly after, he met Jenny Cipriani, the daughter of a shopkeeper who had also come to the U.S. from Italy when she was younger and would become his future wife. After being married, the two set out on a prosperous family path in Fayetteville, West Virginia. The couple had a lot of happiness in Fayetteville. The town itself was populated mostly by Italian immigrants and included many Italian-owned businesses and aspects of Italian culture. 2 miles north of the city limits, George found the family's 2-story timber-framed home. John Sodder, the first of Jenny's 10 children, was born in 1923, just as the Roaring Twenties were getting began. George seen his trucking business take off with unheard-of success for such a small community as additional children were born. The Sodder family rapidly became one of the most well-respected middle-class families in the area as they expanded in both size and wealth. One of the residents said that as the 1920s gave way to the Depression in the 1930s, new babies kept coming. Still, the Sodder family persevered despite national social turmoil and economic downturns. Jenny and George didn't even blink. In actuality, George's strong will and unwavering opinions on contentious issues were the only things harming the Sodders' reputation. His strong views on being patronizing to certain locals, especially when it came to Benito Mussolini, caused a few relationships with the Italian-American community to fall apart. In spite of all the good and bad things that have been said about the Soddo family, George and Jenny brought 10 children into the world, 5 boys and 5 girls, in 1943. John, Joseph, Marion, George Jr., Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, Irene, Betty, and Sylvia. They managed to manage a sizable clan in a modest country lifestyle while living in a 2-story home. The children got along well despite their different ages and generations, each bringing their own personalities and special hobbies to the dining table each night. The Sodder kids never failed to make an impression on their instructors, peers, and parents. Everyone in the West Virginian hamlet would agree that the Sodders left behind a legacy of tenacity, constructive change, and boundless potential that sprang from those kids. Rather, tragedy slowly seeped out of the unfortunate people residing in that 2-story timber house of possibility right before the holidays peaked in 1945. The fascist reign of Benito Mussolini came to an end when he was executed in Italy on April 28, 1945, by Italian forces. Meanwhile, George Sodder continues to criticize the tyrant brutally in the Italian immigrant town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, which offends and annoys other Italian Americans. 6 months later, in October 1945, a mystery life insurance salesman rings George Sorel's doorbell and tries to talk him into getting insurance. The salesman is promptly fired by George, and the insurance expert becomes agitated. George hears him shout, "Your children will be destroyed and the Sodder home will go up in smoke." He goes on to say that the offensive comments you will be making about Mussolini are the source of this threat. Shortly after the salesman incident in October, a second male visitor shows up at the Sodder home with questionable purpose. After being recognized by George, the visitor claims to be searching for general employment and proceeds to walk the Sodder patriot behind his house. The guest says there will be a fire in the back, pointing to 2 nearby fuse boxes. Although the electrical firm just rewired the property and declared the results to be safe and secure, George is confused but not concerned. In the initial weeks of December 1945, the elder Sodder brothers observed an oddly parked vehicle near the main road passing through the downtown area. It seemed as though the car was watching the younger Sodder siblings make their way home from school every afternoon. The Sodder family observes the holidays as any other family would on Christmas Eve, 1945. Working at a nearby dime store, Mary Ann, the eldest daughter, brings home additional small toys for her younger sisters, Betty, Jenny, and Martha. Because of their enthusiasm over the surprise, Miss Sodder sets a later bedtime. At 10 p.m., she gives 2 of the boys, Maurice and Louis, the order to watch their sisters, so long as they take care of the farm animals before going to bed. They both nod, and the kids amuse themselves by going to sleep, with Mrs. Sodder following shortly after. Mrs. Sodder answers the phone when it rings at 12:30 a.m., just after midnight. A female voice that is unrecognizable is on the other line. She calls for someone who can hear muffled laughing and what sounds like clinking glasses in the background of the phone call. Someone who does not exist in Mrs. Sodder's thoughts. The woman laughs strangely when Mrs. Sodder tells her that she must have the wrong number, as Mrs. Sodder would later characterize it. She thinks it strange that the usually well-behaved kids would have left the house in such a condition when she returns to her room and discovers the living room lights and drapes are still open. Mrs. Sodder goes back to bed, brushing it off as Marie and snoozes on the couch. Only half an hour later, at 1 a.m, something strikes the house's roof and reverberates inside with a loud thud and a rolling noise. Mrs. Sodder wakes up to look into it once more. She returns to her sleep, though, only to be met by quiet. After another 30 minutes, at approximately 1:30 a.m., that's Miss Sodder waking up for the 3rd time. When she smells smoke, she runs to her bed. She notices that George's office is on fire in the hallway, with the fire spreading to the fuse box and phone cables. Jenny doesn't waste any time in waking up her father, who then tells his 2 oldest sons. In the ensuing minutes, George, his spouse, their daughter Marion, their sons John and George Jr., and the young child Sylvia all manage to flee without harm. They can't get up the flaming stairs to save the other kids who are sleeping in the attic, so they try calling out to them. The immediate aftermath is one of panic as well as turmoil. When Mary Ann tries to call emergency services using the family phone on the ground floor of the house, she discovers that it is inoperable. So she dashes to the neighbor's house to borrow their phone to call the fire brigade. At the same time, a motorist on a nearby road notices the fire across the street and proceeds to a bar in order to personally phone the fire brigade. It was later discovered that the driver never calls 911, most likely because of a malfunctioning phone. Rather, a bystander witnessing the fire or the Sodders' neighbor dashes onto the town square and dials 911 from downtown Fayetteville. In the meantime, every last-minute scheme the Sodder family devises fails because of unfavorable events. First, disregarding the injuries and bloodstains from the incident, George scales the house in his pants and smashes an attic window. He needs a ladder to help him climb inside, though, and in an odd turn of events, the ladder that is typically placed against the house is nowhere to be found, even after George and the two older lads made a strong push. Then, the jubilant soldiers decide to use their water bucket to douse some of the house fires, but they find the water has frozen and is of no use. When George finally tries to bring his work trucks up alongside the siding to the house and climb up there instead, the vehicle's engines refuse to start. The Sodder family, thinking the rest of their children are trapped inside and will undoubtedly perish in the fire, watches helplessly as their devoted home burns to the ground for the next 45 minutes on Christmas Day, early in the morning. Eventually, the fire department shows up on the site the next day. They attribute their delayed reaction time to the impacts of the war, a shortage of workers, and the incapacity of the overnight fire chief to operate the fire truck. Christmas 1945. The fire had subsided by 10 a.m., and the firefighters are combing over the burn area. They say the missing youngsters are dead even though they supposedly find no bones. There are conflicting reports claiming the firefighters discovered organs and bones that morning, but these reports are never verified, and experts subsequently claim their 10 a.m. search was ineffective. Nevertheless, after finishing their investigation, the firemen determined that the Sodder children's remains were entirely incinerated. The fire was hot enough to remove any remnants from the scene, the disaster erasing years of legacy building for the Sodder family. But the surviving members are already starting to doubt the official conclusions about the end of the fire. A sudden interest in learning more about the true fate of the departed kids and the potential that they just vanished. The surviving members of the Sodder family were increasingly doubtful of the entire home fire inquiry as the days, months, and years passed. They were worried about the minor facts that emerged from their everyday lives, but they were also worried by the official conclusions of the fire department and what seemed to be a lack of effort to arrive at a suitable conclusion. The Sodders recruited private investigator C in the midst of their urgent hunt for a more certain answer. C. Tinsley of West Virginia's Gauley Bridge to look into the fire and upcoming case files. Tinsley conducted work beyond the purview of emergency services and law enforcement, gathering additional material that served to distort the facts. But one piece of information that Tinsley discovered stands out a little more than the others. It serves as more of an eliminator, letting us know what should and shouldn't be taken into account in a vat of inconclusivity, rather than pointing to a satisfactory conclusion. While Tinsley was scouring Fayetteville to gather information from rumors and murmurs, he often overheard a recurring rumor about Fire Chief F.J. Morris finding a human heart after the Sodder House fire. They found no remains even though they tied the family. Morris allegedly took the heart personally, packaged it, and stored it in a metal container buried someplace in West Virginia, according to the rumors. After following up on the tip, Tinsley discovered that Morris had allegedly confessed to a prominent local religious person. George Sodder personally went over to the clergyman who attested to Morris's confession. Chief Morris gave in to his shame when George and Tinsley caught him in a lie during their interview. He led the two guys to the metal box's last resting place and displayed the heart he had discovered in 1945. The plot twist emerged when the ancient heart was brought to a funeral director in West Virginia in the days that followed. After the funeral inspector examined the organ, he discovered that it was not a heart at all, but rather beef liver with no fire damage or scarring. This indicates that Revitt Chief Morris did not obtain the organ from ground zero on the Sodder property. More rumors circulated in the community after the beef liver hoax, stating Morris had acknowledged to using the organs to deceive the Sodder family into thinking their children had actually perished in the fire. These rumors aligned with his unit's original report. Therefore, even though the buried tin can heart had no direct bearing on the missing children's recovery, it did, in the big picture, highlight one crucial element: that the fire department was prepared to genuinely fabricate a body part in order to prevent more conspiracy, suspicion, and their own lack of faith, and that their assertion that the children were burnt totally in the fire was, at best, conjecture. It casts a great deal of doubt on those who were supposed to exercise due diligence in determining the destinies of the 5 children who were left inside the burning house. How can anybody else, much less the actual living relatives, be confident the children were killed in the fire if the fire chief wasn't? It compels us to consider who else might know something, or worse, be complicit in what might be more than a chance fire. Rather, a violent act of arson motivated by a desire to murder or, odd still, kidnap 5 innocent people. Recall the insurance salesman who, a few months prior to the fire, threatened George Soter after learning of his remarks about Mussolini. He was among the initial dubious individuals that Private Investigator C focused on. Tinsley, C. The individual who has not yet been recognized was reportedly a member of the coroner's panel that declared the Soter house fire to be an official accident. Although this may be written off as a coincidental event, it's important to take the salesman into consideration as a potential dark horse given his unkind behavior and needless harassing of George Soter. Similarly, numerous case supporters have identified additional possible Italian-related subjects as prospective culprits. Many unanswered inquiries have been made concerning George's possible connections to the Italian mafia and his expanding business network in the years around Christmas 1945. George never disclosed the details of his first immigration to the United States, despite his repeated denials of these accusations. There are rumors that he and his brother left their native nation to avoid a family conflict. Some people think the Serra family owed money to the mafia in Italy. From a more pragmatic perspective, George's membership in the Mussolini ranks might have provoked resentment among the incorrect kinds of Mussolini supporters, leading to acts of violence from individuals with hidden animosity. Here is the second set of Italian-rated presumptions. When they learned of a wealthy businessman's disapproval, the Mussolini followers decided to exact revenge. Critics of this idea point out that many battalions supporting Mussolini and fascism would have made political remarks about their actions, making it clear when and where they struck, and they probably wouldn't have left a crime scene with so few autographs. If someone was attacking the Soters for political purposes, it was probably a lone, covert person. One such specific person suspected of being involved in the fire was a small-time burglar who was spotted by the Soters' neighbors creeping around their home over the Christmas season of 1945 and taking firewood from the surrounding area. The individual was recognized by investigators, who then located him to question him. Admitting to taking the block and tackle, the robber explained that he had cut the phone wires because he mistook them for a power line. Unfortunately, no official record of this thief's identification was ever retained, making it impossible to delve further into the man's past. It's just another instance of circumstantial coincidence, but it has to be properly acknowledged given the ambiguity of the findings. The most popular idea surrounding the tragedy of the Soter children challenges whether Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty even perished at all. Many amateur detectives speculate that the 5 children were abducted and either aborted to a different fate or aborted to an entirely new universe where they were raised, rather than dying in the fire. The mother, Jenny Soter, was the theory's first and most well-known proponent. She made 2 references. First, she never really thought that her children's bodies could be totally destroyed in the fire. First, she noticed numerous non-burned personal items and household appliances among the debris. Second, Ms. Soter recalled an article she had read in the local newspaper recently about a house fire that had occurred not too distant from hers, in which 7 people perished but left only skeletal remains. Jenny gathered animal bone fragments and burnt them for a long time since she was too curious to pass the opportunity. None of the bones burnt through twice in spite of this. Mrs. Soter then forwarded her results to a worker at a nearby crematorium as evidence for her experiments. The worker attested to the fact that after a fire burns for 2 hours at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, 1,090 degrees Celsius, human bones will still be there. This is significantly hotter and lasts longer than what the Soter house fire could have. Where did the kids go, then? If the corpses couldn't have been burned completely through and no remains had been found, over the past few years, numerous people have come forward with possible, confirmed sightings, stating that the children were still alive at the time of their possible sightings. George Sodder, the father, made one of the earliest observations. He was reading a newspaper in 1949 that had images of a New York City ballet dancer. Among them was a young woman who looked a lot like Betty, one of his lost daughters. Without much delay, George crossed state lines and went to the young girl's school just to make sure. George tried to glimpse her face in the classroom, but the school prevented him from doing so. Despite his insistence on being paid and his explanation of the peculiar situation, 3 years later, with little progress being made, the Sodder family put up a few billboards with photographs of their 5 missing children along West Virginia state roads. Soon later, further eyewitness accounts surfaced claiming to have seen some of the kids funneled into the system. Not quite a week later, Ida Crutchfield, the operator of a Charleston hotel, provided the first significant report. She claimed that on an undisclosed occasion from the prior year, she had welcomed 4 adults of Italian descent who had arrived at the hotel at midnight with 5 little children who were the same age and gender as the Sodder children. Ida claimed that when she tried to talk to the kids, one of the males gave me a nasty look. He spun around and started speaking quickly in Italian. The entire group stopped chatting to me right away. She continued by claiming that the party departed early the following day. Law enforcement, who believed she had waited too long to come forward with information, never gave the accusation much thought. Even though she was aware of the Sodder children's appearance 5 years before she made her allegation. Between smaller-scale sightings, George Sodder traveled the nation interviewing tipsters in an effort to discover his own sons and daughters. One woman in St. Louis believed she spotted Martha Sodder being detained in a nearby convent. One night, a second person overheard 2 other customers at a Texas pub making damning remarks regarding a house fire that had occurred on Christmas Eve in West Virginia years earlier. When a relative on Jenny Sodder's side produced children in Florida that were said to resemble George's children, even George's own relatives became suspects in his eyes. To officially remove them off his own Rolodex of suspicions, he had to pay them a personal visit. When a named woman wrote to the Sodders in 1967, claiming that their lost son Louis Sodder had revealed his true identity while intoxicated one night and possibly be residing someplace in Texas with his other missing sibling Maurice, George's largest research led him to Texas. Upon failing to locate the woman, George and his son-in-law, Grover Paxton, sought assistance from the police in locating the 2 males mentioned in her account. Once again, George was left with nothing as these individuals denied being the Sodder children on multiple occasions. Grover subsequently informed those following the case that George, who wasn't entirely sure these weren't his own children, was haunted to his grave by these 2 men's denials. Out of all the sightings and witness accounts provided by outsiders, 1967 yielded the most concrete proof of the Sodder children's survival that any member of the family has ever seen or heard of. One day, while Jenny Sodder was opening her mail, she noticed a letter from Central City, Kentucky that was expressly addressed to her. No return address or other hints were included. Jenny opened it and saw a picture of a young man who looked to be in his late 20s or early 30s. His face traits matched those of Louis, the missing Sodder boy, who, had he survived, would have been around that age. Jenny discovered the following writing on the picture when she turned it over. Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. Young boys a 90132 or 35. Encouraged by their renewed optimism, the Sodder family hired a second private investigator to travel to Center City and look into the letter's origin. However, the PI never returned to Fayetteville, leaving the family unable to get in touch with him. One of the most intriguing parts of the whole case is this. Their investigator vanishes and is never heard from again, just as the family is about to locate the sender after receiving a sizable tip in the mail. The most dubious theory that is currently circulating holds that the image actually shows Lewis, who was sending a desperate hint while maybe still under duress, and that the man dispatched to find him met the same end and died. The Sodder family's hearts were won over by the camera shot, even though it will never be possible to confirm who is staring through it. They placed one on the mantle at their new house and added the picture on the billboards along the highway. Many of the family's own hands-on investigations came to a stop in 1969 when George Sodder passed away, 2 years after the mystery surrounding the unidentified photos. The Sodders have even less hope than they did in the winter of 1945 as the sightings and speculations begin to taper down as well. The two remaining ideas, that the children were taken somewhere else or that they died in the fire, are split fairly evenly. One may argue for or against each of their polarities, but neither one seems to have much more traction than the other. Reporters and experts have offered their fair share of insights and conclusions regarding the case, and even when they publicly state that the Sodder children most likely passed away on Christmas Eve night, they leave open the possibility that the 5 children could have survived, and that it would not come as a shock to learn that they were still alive in 1946 at the beginning of the new year. Prior to disclosing our conjecture of the circumstances and factual background surrounding Maurice, Martha, Lewis, Jenny, and Betty Sodders, we only have access to the same data that is shown in each video, and we make no effort to provide certainty or an expert guarantee regarding the conclusions we draw at the end. All we do is watch research and write about it. Regarding the specifics of what transpired on Christmas Eve, 1945, we think that deliberate or malevolent arson caused the fire. The Sodders' Christmas lights weren't illuminated and operational during the early phases of the fire, so the fire department's assertion that an electrical issue was the cause of the fire doesn't make sense. If the coroner's jury's claim about defective wiring caused the flames, the house's power would have been cut off, and the outside lights should not have been left on. Additionally, there were hints that, after the fire had started, someone else was deliberately hindering the Sodders' ability to enter the attic. Taking into account that the ladder, which was normally leaning against the house, was situated roughly 75 feet away from the property at the base of an embankment. At an unknown time that evening, a bus driver who had passed the Sodder property spotted 2 individuals hurling fireballs at the house. In the spring of 1946, Sylvia Sodder came across a firm rubber ball-like object in the brush on the Sodder farm. It had the appearance of a hand grenade or pineapple bomb. Recall that just before to the smell of smoke entering the building, Jenny Sodder heard a thump on the roof of the home and then a rolling sound, like a ball rolling down a sloping roof. Taking everything into account, there was too much evidence still present at the site to rule out arson. Regarding the 5 Sodder children's deaths, we think they managed to flee the attic before they were consumed by the flames. Apart from the earlier research and accounts stating that no bones or remains were discovered in the ash, a second excavation was conducted in 1949 and nothing was discovered to support the alternate theory. A dictionary, a few coins, and human vertebrae were discovered during a much more thorough dig conducted in August of that year by Washington, D.C. pathologist Oscar Hunter. Marshall T. Newman, a researcher at the Smithsonian, examined the bones and discovered that they belonged to a single person who was between the ages of 16 and 22. Maurice was the oldest missing child. He was 14 years old at the time and was found not to be the carrier of these particular bones. Additionally, Newman discovered that the bones had been in the dirt brought into the site after the house fire and had not been exposed to heat. Experts surmised that they originated from a West Virginia cemetery close to Mount Hope and were returned to the family in December 1949, never to be seen again. Thus, it is exceedingly implausible that the children's bodies burnt along with the other possessions if 2 professional excavations were conducted and not a single trace of the buried victims' physical remains was discovered. Regarding the Sodder children's true destiny, it's safe to conclude that the rest of the family, whether it be gangsters or disgruntled Italian-American neighbors, was correct when they believed they had been abducted or taken against their will. As absurd as it may sound, the remaining Soder siblings think that 5 of their father's children were abducted by the Sicilian mafia after they refused to comply with their demands for money. This explains George's complete silence on his tragic childhood and his flight from Italy. The kidnapper guaranteed the safety of the kids trapped in the attic and knew who was organizing the arson. Recalling the condition of the house on Christmas Eve, with the curtains drawn, the lights on, and the children's whereabouts upstairs never verified by Mrs. Soder herself as midnight approached. The notion that a stranger was inside the house and that the 5 children had been taken away is supported by no evidence. It's possible that they were brought to Italy knowing that their relatives back home would be in danger. The reason behind their prolonged silence following the catastrophe, should they attempt to get in touch with them again. About the purported 1967 photo of Louis Soder, one significant hint lends credence to this notion. The digits scrawled on the paper's reverse side, such as 900132 or 35, might be postal codes. 90132 is located in Sri Lanka and is probably a mistake. But if you replace 32 with 35, the zip code for this is 90,135, which is in Italy. Is Louis perhaps dropping signals as to where he is right now? When everything is considered, it is impossible to ignore the fact that the Soder children wouldn't go unnoticed if they were still alive is likely the strongest indication that they survived. Perhaps in the future, a more efficient way to locate the man in the mystery portrait of the core city will allow someone to visit these sites. Whatever the case, the catastrophe that befell George, Jenny, and the children who were still alive was unlike anything that had ever occurred in a little West Virginian hamlet before. All 5 of those children had a lifetime of unrealized potential ahead of them. Their legacy was just getting started, having been successfully raised by George and Jenny and ripened by their pedagogical guidance. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty Soder were the future of not just their family but also of Fayetteville and the United States in general. They were well liked by the majority of the community and were on their way to establishing their own successful careers. Whether or not they passed away or vanished is secondary to the fact that everything that occurred was unfair, unjust, and should serve as a warning to everyone about how fleeting life is and how valuable it is. The only living member of the original Soder clan is Sylvia Soder Paxton. She still has a great deal of trust in discovering her missing siblings, or at the very least learning their official fate. Perhaps this case's revival will allow her wishes to be fulfilled. With resiliency and persistence, the remaining family members' dying hopes were realized. We will keep looking for answers for the 5 souls that were kept in the dark on Christmas Eve 1945 until then. One day, figuring out the disappearance of the Soder children and the mysteries surrounding it will destroy not just a house, but also a dynamic and loved family tree. Thanks for watching.